All right, let's get started. Good afternoon. Uh, I'm very happy to introduce a new friend to APU, Professor Sonalde Desai. Professor Sonalde Desai is a senior fellow at NCAER, National Council for Applied Economic Research, and she's a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland at College Park. Before her work, apart from being a professor and a visiting fellow at NCR, she's been a visiting scholar in several institutions such as the World Bank Development Research Group, the Population Council, and the RAND Corporation, and she's held postdoctoral positions at the University of Chicago and at the Max Planck Institute in West Berlin. She's known to many of us as the author and the primary researcher behind what is called the Indian Human Development Survey, which is well known as the IHDS. But more broadly, her work deals with human development in developing countries with a focus on gender and class inequalities. She does a lot of comparative work, not just in India, but comparative work in South Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So today she's going to talk to us about family changes in India and South Asia. So I'd like to invite her.
Thank you for the invitation. It is my first visit to Azim Premji University, and I have really enjoyed it. It sounds like a great program. I wish it existed when I was a graduate student. Okay. Sounds like, you know, I was quite amazed to hear the amount of interdisciplinary work that goes on here. And hopefully my talk today will sort of add to it. Because I am a sociologist by training, I do sort of more work on demography, family, etc. And then I have slowly been branching out into other fields, looking at employment, poverty, and so on. So this kind of gives me a chance to bring together some of the work on families and demography, and then sort of look at it in the context of broader social changes in India. So let me tell you the structure of the presentation. Okay. I'm first going to talk about at a sort of a high and very macro level about some of the areas and fields in which Indian families are changing, and some of the areas where they are not changing. Okay. Then what I want to do is look at India in the context of what is happening in other parts of Asia. Again, that's sort of more describing, you know, where does India fit into what we are seeing in other parts of the country or other parts of this particular region. And then finally what I'm going to do is focus on sort of a more analytical piece on what makes Indian families decide to have a small number of children, particularly what makes some families stop at having just one child. Okay? So that's sort of the sequence of what you're going to hear from me. The first two parts are very descriptive, just giving you a broad overview. And the final part sort of is a more analytical piece which looks at the specific motivations behind the kind of decisions that people may make. Okay. I do not know how much you can see or not, but if you can't, there aren't a whole lot of numbers that you'll need to read, but if you can't, we can maybe shut off some light if needed. Okay. I wanted to just acknowledge my co-authors from whose work I'm borrowing in this presentation. The first one is work I have done with Jean Young from National University of Singapore and Gavin Jones, which is doing more comparative work across the Asia. And the second piece of work is with a very well-known demographer, Alaka Basu. So those are the sources from which I'm borrowing. If we think in terms of, you know, what's been happening to Indian families in recent years, I mean, what are the big changes? Well, if you think about it, there are some areas in which there have been massive changes, and some areas in which there has been very little change. And I'll go through and give you some statistics on it. But I would say, first, Indian fertility has declined sharply. There are very few Indian families now who would feel comfortable saying, you know, I have 6 children. Okay? The family size has really dropped sharply. Second thing that has happened is that education levels have increased, which I don't need to tell people in this room. They have increased, and they have increased for both boys and girls. Okay? On the other hand, what is not changing? Okay? And some of this may find somewhat controversial to you, so let me come to the statistics and tell you about it more. Okay? What's not changing is that the marriage systems in India are maybe moving slightly, but still arranged marriages remain highly persistent. Multi-generational families also persist. There are very few old people living on their own. Okay? And women's participation in paid labor force remains pretty low, and by some statistics, it's even going down. Okay? So here we see one area of tremendous change, one area of not so big change. Let's look at the statistics. Okay? Fertility in India has fallen sharply. Total fertility rate, which is the number of children a family can expect to have if they go through the fertility rates that are prevalent right now, has fallen sharply. In order for one couple to replace themselves, typically the TFR or total fertility rate needs to be slightly above 2. Okay? 2 children, 2 parents, that would be the replacement, and a slight increase for potential mortality. What has happened is now is that we are very, very close to replacement level for India as a whole. In 1990s, the total fertility rate was 5.6 children. In 1970s it was 5.6 children, in 1990s it was 4, and now the latest data from National Family Health Survey shows that the TFR is just 2.2 children. And what's even more important is that in urban areas, it has fallen below replacement level, 1.8 children. There are 7 states in the country, okay, which actually have a TFRs of less than 2. Okay? So in some sense, if we had an image of India as uncontrolled population explosion, okay, I think we need to change our image. Okay? So clearly there is a major social change there. Second, change that has taken place is there has been a sharp increase in education. This is data from India Human Development Survey looking at children 15 to 18. And what we find is that the proportion of teenagers who are in either school or college has gone up rapidly. For both boys and girls, for boys it's 75% who are still in school, for girls it's 70% who are still in school. And this is a real increase from just 5 years ago, when for girls the number was 56%. Okay? So that's a sharp increase in education levels. Okay? All positive news. Now, if you look at the family dynamics that are exhibited in terms of the marriage patterns, okay? Arranged marriages persist widely. Okay? What we see today is that, I don't know that you can read the numbers, and nor can I read it very well, but give me 1 second. Okay. Roughly about 65% of the marriages where where the respondent would tell you that the marriage was arranged with some input from bride, but mostly by the parents. There are 40% of the households in which women would tell you that my parents made all the marriage arrangements. And there are only 5%, okay, families where we get a response from women that I chose my husband. Okay? This is what we would classically call love marriages. Okay? The rest of it is all arranged marriages, sometimes with input from the bride and sometimes not. Okay? Now, what does it mean actually? Okay? What do these inputs mean, okay, is a very interesting question. Okay. So, the next slide shows you the proportion of households. I need to see if I can, give me 1 second, okay, I need to, magnified slightly. Is there a way we can magnify it so that I can read it?
I can try.
Yeah. Unfortunately,
So,
okay.
but this is going to
But
be
then that's going to affect everybody else. All right, no problem. Okay, this is good enough, don't worry.
No, I think you
Okay.
need some help. Let me see.
No,
Are you sure?
it's fine. Okay. So the orange bar at the bottom is, yeah, oh, thank you. Orange bar at the bottom is where women never got a chance to meet their husband before they got married. Okay. The different bars are different levels of education. The leftmost one is no education, and the rightmost one is college education, college graduate. Okay. So what you see is that the orange bar is where she didn't get a chance to meet at all. The red bars are the one where she didn't meet the guy, but she at least got to see his photograph. The blue bars are where they had a telephone conversation or an email exchange, and the green bars are where they actually got to meet. Okay? So what's the story? Even among college educated women, only half of our respondents who are age 15 to 49, okay, tell us that they got a chance to meet their husband before they got married. Okay. I won't show all the statistics here, but a very vast proportion of people, even if they met the husband, they would meet them and get married within 2 or 3 weeks. Okay. So, I mean, I think that we have a very strong culture of arranged marriages, although individuals may have some input in who they marry. Okay? And this, in some sense, has a tremendous impact on the nature of family structure, as I'll come to talk about in a few minutes, okay? When we look at India in comparison with other countries. The second thing that we have to remember about India is that joint family is alive and well. Okay? This is data for individuals age 60 and above. Roughly, for men, about close to 70% of them live with their married children. For women, about 77% live with their married children. Moreover, a significant percentage, which is the blue bars, okay, live with their unmarried children. Now remember, a 60-year-old will also have unmarried children. Many of you have parents who are 60 years old, right? So really what we need to do is look at people who are, as they get older, 70 and 80 and so on, and by that time a vast majority are living with their married children. The percentage of individuals who live alone, okay, is only between 2 to 6%, depending upon whether we are looking at men or women. Okay? So what it tells you is that joint families persist. Okay? Almost all elderly tend to live with their children. Okay? And that has a tremendous impact on what you sort of think about in terms of how many children you have, how do you educate them, etc., etc. The final area in which we see very little change is work participation rates. Okay? And work participation rates for women have been declining both in urban and rural areas. You know, we think, okay, that India has grown, education has increased, there are more opportunities, there should be more women working. Okay? Instead, what we see is that women's labor force participation rate has stagnated in some cases. Like urban, it's more or less the same, slight decrease. But in rural area, there has been a fairly sharp decrease for women, which we don't see for men. Okay? So clearly, there are areas where we would expect to see major transformations of Indian society hasn't been taking place. All right, that's about India. Let me show some of the statistics to you in comparative perspective, so we get to see where India stands compared to East Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. Around Asia, we have seen enormous social transformation, but it's variable. It hasn't happened in every country, not all the time, but nonetheless, there has been quite a transformation. Many countries have experienced very high rates of economic growth. Almost all countries have seen rise in education levels. And the two have combined to sort of create changes in family structures around most of the Asia. But I should also note that these changes are uneven. Not every country experiences the same kind of a pattern. But overall, we see quite a bit of a change in East Asia, somewhat less change in Southeast Asia, and more of a stagnation in most countries of South Asia. So the first graph shows you fertility patterns. Okay? The leftmost graph is East Asia. The middle is Southeast Asia, which is Indonesia, Myanmar, Malaysia, etc. And the final one is South Asia, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and so on. And what you see is that in pretty much all regions, fertility is falling. It has reached different levels. Okay? In East Asia, it has fallen most rapidly, and it's at a much lower level. Several countries have less than a replacement level or less than 2. Some countries have TFRs of a very low 1.2, 1.4. Okay? Southeast Asia, it has also declined. It's roughly about half a child less than in South Asia. And South Asia has also experienced change. India's fertility decline is one of the sharpest in South Asia. So when it comes to fertility decline, everybody has experienced it, although it's the biggest and largest in East Asia. When it comes to marriage, okay, we see much less change. This is the figure that shows you mean age at marriage for people who ultimately get married. Right? There are some people who will never get married, but for people who get married, and mostly under age 50, this is the mean age at marriage. And we can see an increase in the East Asia component of it. You can also see an increase in Southeast Asia, at least in some of the countries. But we see relatively smaller change, and this is where India is. It goes from 17 to 20 as a mean age at marriage. And most of it is actually elimination of child marriage. Okay? And so, you push up take away the child marriage, and there is an increase in mean age at marriage. Okay? It's probably most clearly seen when we look at the proportion of women who remain single. What we are seeing here is proportion of women aged 30 to 34 who have never gotten married. Look at East Asia. Okay? Japan has 34% of the women aged 30 to 34 who have never married. Okay? Taiwan and Korea, which are the middle two graphs, have roughly close to 20% who have not gotten married at age 20. China is less. We see a similar pattern in South Asia. Some countries have lower number of people and more universal marriage. But some countries have a significant proportion of women who don't get married until age 30, 34. Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Myanmar, etc. have fairly large proportion of people, roughly around 15% who don't get married at age 30 to 34. Okay? Now, if you look at South Asia and particularly India, which is this particular graph here, India has 2.7% of the women who have not married by age 30 to 34. So by the time you reach age 30, everybody is pretty much married. Okay? The highest number here is 10%, which is for Sri Lanka, which is the lowest, greatest proportion of people not getting married. Rest of South Asia, almost everyone gets married before age 30. So what you see is, you see this tremendous transformation of fertility patterns, very low transformation of marriage patterns for India, but which is not matched by other countries' experiences. Other countries which are undergoing fertility transition are also seeing some sort of a marital transition. Okay? And that's sort of the story I wanted you to keep in mind as we look at the next set. Okay? So the question is, what is it that makes Indian experience, and I think I don't talk about South Asia here, but it kind of applies, okay? What makes the Indian experience so different from that of other countries? Okay? Now this is where sort of demographers have not been very clear in their theoretical frameworks. There are two sets of, two stories that are very popular around demographic transition, and when we say demographic transition, it's usually a decline in both fertility and mortality from very high levels on one hand to going down to very low levels, in some cases as low as 1.2 to 1.4 children. Okay? There are basically two trends that people talk about. The first one is the initial transition in which mortality falls and then fertility falls, and it gets to be a little bit above replacement level. The arguments have been that we move from high fertility to replacement fertility, about 2 child per family. Where we were talking about sort of social networks and social capital and social relationship, you start talking about human capital and education and so on. And where we were talking about social and economic benefits of fertility, you know, having more children means more hands to work your farm, okay, to we start thinking about largely economic costs of the fertility, talking about, you know, how much would it cost to raise a child. The second demographic transition, which is largely, it began in Europe, okay, is where one is going from 2 children to 1 child or no child. Okay. That's a qualitatively different kind of a phenomenon, where focus that was on child quality at one point in time is now moving towards personal freedom, personal fulfillment. Okay, which is what people start seeing children as in some sense burdensome or restricting the person self-actualization. Where we were talking about economic determinants of the fertility, we start now talking about cultural determinants of fertility. The most stylized narrative about this sort of story has been, okay, that first demographic transition is where there is a preoccupation with basic needs. Okay. As opposed to second transition where you are talking about higher order needs such as leisure and self-actualization. Where there used to be segregated gender roles in first transition, we are now moving towards gender equality. Where there was a sort of an ordered life course transition. You know, people first get married, then have a child, or no, first get a job, then get married, then have a child. Okay. Now we are talking about sort of a more flexible life course organization, multiple styles, people could get married before they have a job, etc., etc. And you never may not ever make this complete change from sort of being a child in your parents' house to being an adult parent taking care of your own children and then taking care of your own parents. So that's been sort of this dominant narrative that has come out of the Western experience when we start thinking about very low fertility. Okay? The question is whether it applies to India or not. Okay? And I'd like to argue that it doesn't. Okay? In India, and I'm going to skip actually this slide. Okay? India has also seen decline in fertility, and I want to focus particularly on families that stop at 1 child. Okay? And we actually see an increase in proportion of people who have stopped at 1 child. There are not, you know, there are relatively fewer people who, you know, most people end up having 2 parents, 2 children, but there are a significant number of urban families, okay, where people stop at 1 child, and that trend has been slowly increasing. If we look for urban, educated and rich, okay, we find that a proportion of households which stop at just 1 child keeps increasing. All over India, only 5% of the families have just 1 child. Okay? You look at the highest income quintile, 8% of the families have 1 child. We go to metro city, 13% of the families have 1 child. Okay? And we look at college educated mothers, okay? 23% have stopped at a single child. Okay? And I think actually what you should do is you should talk to some of the younger people who are about 10 years older than them, older than you, and see how many of them have stopped at just one child, okay? And you'll find a large number of these people, okay? Particularly in metro cities, among educated families, etc. Okay? So the question really is, what makes somebody stop at this sort of extremely low fertility, okay? Because we are not seeing much change in the marriage patterns, right? So everybody's getting married, and essentially everybody is having a child, okay? But they're stopping at one, rather than a European pattern where some people won't get married, some people will get married but not have a child, and some people will stop at one child, and some people may go on to 2 children, okay? What we are seeing is this emergence of this particular group where they get married, they have a child, but then stop at one child. Okay? So I'm going to present to you some data from India Human Development Survey. And actually I have used data from this India Human Development Survey even before in the marriage patterns, but I didn't quite refer to it at that point in time. This survey is a nationally representative survey of households, where we had interviewed close to 42,000 households. And this analysis that I'm going to present is based on women who have been married at least once, ages 15 to 49, and then sort of selecting from them women who have stopped at one child and comparing them with other people. Okay? So what I did was I divided up my sample into 3 categories. One is large families. These are people who have had at least 2 children or 2 and more. Okay? In old days, you would have never said these are large families, but now we are calling them large families. Okay? Second group is people who have 1 child, where the oldest child is at least 5 years old. Because if you took somebody who has a child just 1 year or 2 years old, they are not really stopping at 1 child. They could in future go on to have more children. By the time you have a gap of 5 years, there is a good possibility that they have stopped here. And where the mother is still married, and where family has not experienced a child mortality. Because if they have experienced a child mortality, they kind of had 1 child by chance rather than by design. And then there are censored families, families who have no children or a single child that meets a criteria where the child is yet younger than 5, or mother has been divorced, or child has a sibling that has died, because these people could go on to have larger families. So the two categories we are comparing is people with just 1 child and people with 2 and more children. Okay? The final sample that we are looking at is about 22,000 families where there are 2 or more children, and about 1,800 families where there is just a single child. Okay? So the question that I'd like to answer is, why would people stop at just 1 child? Okay? This is the group. Okay? This, if we went by a European standard, should be at the vanguard of social transformation. Okay? Are they really at vanguard of social transformation? I mean, what is it that's making them do this? Now remember, we can't really know what caused them to make these choices. All we can know is, having made this choice, what's the lifestyle that they are living. I would say that this is basically a revealed preference, that they want to have this particular lifestyle that may have led them to make a choice of having 1 child. And some of these individuals may have different preferences, but on average it balances out. So let's just compare. How do these families differ, the single child families differ from those where they have more children? And I want to compare them on 2 characteristics. One characteristic is, or one set of characteristics is aspirations for themselves. Personal fulfillment, wanting to have higher consumption, wanting to live a sort of a different type of a lifestyle where children may restrict that kind of a lifestyle. The second one is where we are looking at aspirations for children, which is investment in children and seeing children as a sort of a ladder of social mobility. Okay? So those are the two sets of characteristics on which I compare them. What I am trying to do is inferring motivation from behavior, and that is a challenge to this particular analysis and to some extent a shortcoming of the analysis, but that's about the only thing one can do to sort of, if we want to address these kinds of questions, unless I had data over 25 years or something. Okay. What I look at are things like labor force participation for women, higher consumption, family dynamics, personal freedom, leisure, etc., and investments in children. I analyze this data using multivariate regressions, either ordinary least square regressions or logistic regressions, depending upon the dependent variable that's being studied. For those of you who have been statistical courses, you will remember that when we are looking at an outcome which is continuous, okay, you would have usually a ordinary least square regression. For an outcome which is yes or no, you know, does the mother participate in labor force or not, then we would be looking at logistic regressions. Okay. And what we are doing here is controlling for differences in age of women, education, caste and religion, place of residence, state of residence, and household income. Okay. So these are the things on which we want to hold those factors constant. So what happens? Well, the first thing we find is women with one child are not more likely to work. Okay. Normally we would say, and there is a massive amount of literature in economics and in sociology, that women find it difficult to combine work with families. And so women who have small number of children are more likely to work than women who have large number of children. Okay. That's definitely not the case for India. Okay. What we find is that women who have smaller children actually are less likely to work than more likely to work, and this difference is statistically significant. And feel free to ask me for explanations for any of these coefficients once we have a Q&A. I'll try to address as much of it as I can as I go along. Okay. Second is, even if we take out, you know, work in family farm or in where it's easy to take your children to work, okay, and focus only on people who are doing salaried work, okay, we still find that there is no relationship between number of children one has and whether women are participating in salaried work. So clearly, childbearing is, you know, wanting to work is not what is limiting women from having children, which has been actually shown quite extensively in other countries. Okay. Okay. Second thing is that anyone who has taken any course in microeconomics would have been told that children, there is a trade-off between higher consumption for self and higher number of children, okay? And we don't find that these households are particularly more consumption oriented, okay? Yes, they have a slightly higher number of assets, okay? But out of the 23 assets that we count, like cot, fridge, car, laptop, computer, phone, etc., there is only a difference of 0.32 items, okay, which is trivial in the grand scheme. Okay. So they're not consuming a whole lot more. Okay. To put it in perspective, primary education is associated from no education to primary education. We see number of assets increased by 0.83, and college graduation is 4.87, whereas going from 2 to 1 child seems to be only 0.32 number of assets. Okay, so it's a very small. Okay. Women with 1 child have no more personal freedom than others. They don't watch a lot more TV. They watch an extra 6 minutes per day. They are only about 1.04 times as likely to visit their natal family as others. So it's not as if they have a lot of time to do social activities and other things. Okay. They are hardly more likely to go out to movies, go to fairs, restaurants, whatever else. Okay. And more importantly, they are less likely to have frequent communication with their husbands. I think that's because children perhaps just increases, more children, more to talk about, but clearly it's not as if, the marital quality is very different, their personal freedom is greater, okay? All the things that we would sort of think about, of the Western transition doesn't seem to be true here. What is true, okay, is the children with one child invest more in this particular child. They are far more likely to spend money on this child. They are far more likely to send them in private schools, okay? And they are, none of the gender disadvantage that we see on educational expenditure for other families is seen for one-child families. So girls in one-child families are as well educated as boys in one-child families, okay? So what we see is basically much of the difference between families at different childbearing levels seems to be located in the investment in these children. So I think what I would argue is that there is a sort of, there is quite a bit of some anthropological literature on fertility, social mobility, and what one would argue here is that curtailing fertility, having just one child, invest a lot in this child, is perhaps a strategy family use to make sure that over a longer period there is greater income, there is greater social mobility, etc. And if you remember what I was showing you before on joint families and reliance on children as an old age security, that makes sense, right? So if you are going to end up living with one of your children, it may be better to invest, make sure that you have one and invest a lot in that child, okay? So what does this mean for family change in India? And this is my final slide, okay? I think family is alive and well in India. Kinship ties remain very strong. But India has also entered an era of aspirational revolution. Only this aspirational revolution is not necessarily for oneself as much as for sort of the family and children, and we are seeing this enormous investments in children that are being made by urban middle class families, and to some extent percolating down to rural educated families as well, okay? Of course, the problem is that most of the people in this room know whether these investments actually result in better future for these children remains unknown, and it's something to be thought about. I guess we'll figure it out over time. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonalde, for a really interesting sort of presentation. Our floor is open for questions. Should we take a few questions and then we can go around? Sure.
Just find a pen so I can write down. Go ahead.
So, ma'am, you mentioned a point in which you said children are seen as ladder for social control. So I don't want you to put some more light on it. I was not able to get that.
Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
And then also I felt that as the marriage number is not changing, like it is still the pattern is same, and whereas the fertility is decreasing. So that's, I don't know, I mean, that's my thought. I would want you to further put light on. Is that marriage is actually seen as a lot of cultural norm, like you just have to get married. Like it's a stamp kind of a thing. And after that, whatever you do, it's a decision of not the family, but the couple that you are staying. So I don't know how that, like, is it related or not? That is the reason that the marriage number is not changing, but the decision of is.
Yeah, thanks.
anybody saying?
Yeah,
Ma'am, I don't know how much this question is relevant for this fertility and all this thing, but there is a something government had made a coming up with a rule or guideline that whoever is trying to contest election in India in like Nagar Panchayat or urban like municipality, they need to have two-child norms. Like you can't have more than 2 children, and you can't. If you have, then you can't contest. And there are many things in against of this, and also in the favor of this. People are they're mixed kind of things.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to what you say in this.
So I know the IHDS also has a lot of other information on empowerment. To what extent does the woman make the decision within a family about, it could be financial decisions and other kinds of decision-making processes. Do you find that that in families with one child, women are more empowered in decision-making relative to families with a larger number of children?
Hi, Sonalde. So, two questions. One is how do you see the urban family structure changing? Like, is the number of members in the family increasing with the parents living in the same household? Secondly, how do you see urban new middle class women's want participation and kinship ties within those kind of families?
So social mobility, I was thinking in terms of the family wanting to reach higher income and higher status level. And one way of doing it would be to say, look, I educate my son to be a doctor, okay? And so he becomes a doctor, my family progresses, okay? Or something else, but you know, invest in my child so that the child acquires a social status which gets reflected onto parents, okay? On the marriage, it's a really interesting question, and I have to say I have not actually thought about this, but as I reflect on, you know, just talking this through, okay, what he asked was that fertility decisions are more, marriage decisions are more family decisions, okay. Parents decide when this person should get married. If you get, you know, start approaching, you know, ripe old age of 28, you start getting lectures from your parents, it's time to get married. Whereas fertility is something that couples decide for themselves, okay? I think that may be true, okay? That in some sense, and there may be two sides of the same coin, okay? That it's the couples, parents are sort of always thinking about their children, whether it comes to their marriage or how many children to have so that we can invest in these children. Okay? So in some sense, it's not so much a decision for self and a couples as much as sort of a family decision. It's just that the unit that you think about as family changes. Okay? Election and two-child norms. So that's a really interesting question. Okay? Clearly, we have two-child norms that will not allow you to contest elections, and yet we have Rabri Devi and Lalu Prasad Yadav, do they have 11 children? I can't remember quite, okay? But some vast number, okay? Oh, only 10, okay. 9, okay. But I must say that I think these norms are sort of there. I don't know how much they are being implemented. There are similar norms about not getting maternity leave for government employees for births beyond 2. Okay, I personally think these are all draconian norms which are actually quite pointless. One of the most interesting debates that is happening in demographic circles nowadays is whether China's one-child policy actually had as much impact as we all think it does. Okay? Because even after removal of one-child policy, Chinese fertility hasn't gone up very much. Okay? So was it that the social, the transition and economic transition was already taking place that changed people's preferences? Okay? But in India, certainly there is nobody asking somebody to stop at one child. Okay? And yet, I think we are seeing a fairly large proportion of people who have a single child. Okay? So I would say yes, these are laws. How much impact it has, I have no idea. Okay? My guess is not very much. Okay? Now, I'm going to skip over one question so that I can come back to it. The question was, how are urban families changing and what's happening to women in the new middle class? Okay? Urban families, I haven't paid enough attention to the family size transformation in urban families, but I should say that actually much of the change that we might see would come out of declining fertility rather than non-co-residence with parents, because the urban land and the expensiveness of urban housing actually, I suspect, speak more to people having co-residence. But that's something I'm just reflecting on off the top of my head without any statistics to back me up. On the middle class women, I actually do have, I have done a fair amount of work on it. Okay? And I actually think that middle classes are a lot more conservative than lower classes. But there I'm defining middle class as top 20% of India. I'm not talking about your top 1% Bangalore, IT employees. If we are looking at top 20% of India, on almost all dimensions of gender, they have been shown to be more conservative. Women are less likely to go out on their own. Okay? Women are more likely to have lower authority for decision making. Okay? Women are less likely to be employed. Okay? And so overall, I think that one of the things that's sort of interesting is sociologist M.N. Srinivas had written about the gaining of social status through restriction of women and limiting their mobility. And I think that in some sense it might be true that the poor women both are not really playing into the social status game, and second, really don't have much of an option. Okay? I mean, if they need to go out and fetch water, they have to go out and fetch water. Okay? The urban women can often send off their servant to go out and buy tea that they have run out of. Okay? So the ability, the preference for women's seclusion may exist in all families, but an ability to implement it might be lower for lower class families. Okay? Now, I wish I had sufficient sample of very high income families, okay? Because I suspect things might be different there. Okay? It's just that that's not, I don't have enough data, please.
I'm doing a study on work from home women within the IT sector, and women are steadily being displaced from the so-called formal workspace, and they are going back, and the overlap of living space and workspace is
because once more happening, more contingent workers.
Is once more happening, and so women are renegotiating their ties with their in-laws within the scope of that. So from that vantage point, I would love to this question.
That's really interesting. I would love to know more about this.
Yeah, we can talk.
One of the biggest problem about working with survey-based analysis is that at times you miss out these nuances of sort of more richer and deeper understanding. Okay. Now the final question that I skipped over was whether one-child women are more empowered. Because the person sitting next to you, Lekha Subaya from ISEC, is actually working on this topic. Okay, and so I kind of left that area alone, and so as not to poach over a friend's work. But did you find? No, one child, but the lower, smaller families.
And then whether having a son versus having another son versus having another daughter would increase, because there is this idea that if you have a son also brings status to a woman. So we were looking at, I have a low voice, empowerment in terms of childbearing, and I think it was very preliminary. I haven't pushed that further, but the results show that if you had one more son, it didn't improve your empowerment as much as having one more daughter. So there's something about the relationship, in a sense, that you had the ability to have a daughter without, the family sort of controlling. Yeah.
So I guess the jury is out on this particular topic. Okay.
I just wanted to ask you whether,
Yeah, so this has been, I've been tempted to ask this throughout when I saw some of the graphs. Does your study in some way reinforce, can we draw this inference from your study that the age-old pattern of whether parents stopped at at the first child itself because it was a male child? Because then this then relates to your social mobility point, because men are still believed to retain the assets as compared to a female child. So if you have a male child, you stop at that, the first child. If not, you try for another child. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. You had shown in one of your graphs, as of 2015, the total fertility rate was 2.1. 2.2, and in 7 states it was 1.8. Do you think this is an urban phenomenon or it's also a rural phenomenon? If you think it's an urban phenomenon, do you, there's a notion that majority of the population resides in the rural India. So as you had mentioned that India doesn't have so much of a population boom. So can you please justify or elaborate on that statement?
Yeah.
Madam? As statistics depicted in one of the slides, it is shown there was a sharp increase in the education rate, mainly 15 to 18.
Right.
Going for a child and not, it almost influenced, as you said, not of individuals, even of the family unit. Coming to that education, is the government policy of free education has much influence? Thank you.
Ma'am, I have a question not from exactly from your presentation, but the larger theme, family planning. So I'm in a bit of conflict because of the increasing number of fertility clinics in India, and there are a lot of health issues in terms of like that females can't bear childs because of the lifestyle issues or depression after delivery. And then there are a lot of activists coming up after the government banned the condom advertisement during the time when the TV viewer membership was very high. So in that way,
Can you repeat the last sentence?
So there was a government regulation saying that the condoms advertisement from the membership, the viewers membership when it's the highest, it won't be allowed during that time. So I'm not able to put this in the context of the presentation that you gave. So if you could throw some light.
Okay. It's a good question whether parents stop because they had a boy, right? We do see a pattern, generally speaking, that parents will continue to try until they have a girl. A boy. So, first child is a boy, you are more likely to stop. However, what we did find in our data was that among these families we call one-child families, 60% had boys, but 40% had girls. Okay? So it's not totally the boy preference that stopped people. Okay? Now look, this is a small sample, small group, right? So, but there is increasingly a group which values daughters in India, which is in some ways at contrast with this changes in sex ratio statistics that we see. So I think we have a simultaneous two trends going on. Okay. Second question was about TFR of 2.2. Is this just in 1.85? Is it a urban phenomenon or urban-rural differences? Okay. First, I think overall India's fertility is 2.2. Urban fertility is 1.85. So yes, urban areas have lower fertility than rural areas. Okay. And yes, India is largely rural as compared to urban. But if the rural area was not dropping in fertility, it's the rural figures that dominate any composite statistics for India that we present. Okay? So if rural area was not experiencing the fertility decline, we wouldn't have gone from 4 children in 1990 to 2.2 today. So what it tells you is that rural area has a higher fertility, but it is also experiencing a massive decline. I don't have statistics in front of me, but my memory is that rural TFR has fallen to about 2.4 or 2.5. Okay? That's my memory, but I don't have the exact numbers in front of me to tell you that answer. Okay? But that's a pretty big decline. Okay? Second is whether educational increase, is it impact of government policy. Okay? You know, it's funny, there must be, we are congenitally either predisposed to believe in effect of government policy or we are not. And for some reason, I sort of seem to think that a lot of government policies are implemented in breach. Okay? Because if it was really true that government policies have an impact, then one would think that dowry rates would be going down too. Okay? But let me come back. I mean, I think that government is certainly interested in educational infrastructure. There is no question about it. Okay? And I do think that it has had an impact in expansion of education, particularly at the primary level. Okay? When it comes to the secondary education, perhaps the impact of government investments might be smaller, but it is worth looking at. The only thing to remember also though is that the private school enrollment in India is also going up sharply. So in that sense, that government sector is shrinking. In urban areas today, only about 50% of the children go to government schools. Okay? The rest of the 50% are in private schools. So the policy impact is on a particular segment of the population. Then there is a question about fertility clinics, family planning programs, and just the broad contraceptive family planning policy around the country. Okay. I think it's very interesting when you think about Indian family planning policy, or now we call family welfare policy. It has gone through so many swings, up and down. There have been periods of very high implementation, periods of very low implementation, periods of emergency when forcible sterilization for men took place, the later periods when there were very strong incentives given to family planning workers to ensure that women underwent sterilization. Okay? I think all of those have had some impact, but this massive decline in fertility that we are seeing right now, okay, it would be hard to sort of attribute it to either the pro-natalist or anti-natalist policies of the government. Okay? I think that there is a whole issue of sort of a latent demand that gets generated out of families, and then it is in its effectiveness, government policies make a difference. Okay? So for example, if people want to have a very small number of families, if pills are available, people will take pills. If pills are not available and only thing that's available is sterilization, one might use sterilization. Okay? So in terms of having a preference for small families is something much more coming from internal decision within the households. But its implementation and successful implementation is very much a function of availability and supply of contraception. Okay? Fertility clinics now are a very different story. Okay? Fertility clinics are sort of designed to serve variety of different purposes. including dealing with infertility, okay, as well as dealing with sex preference and sex selective abortion, sex selective. There are people who are sort of arguing that certain types of implantation procedures may be more likely to generate boys, and so on and so forth. That's not an area in which I know a whole lot about, okay? And I suspect this is a good area for research for people who are interested in sort of a longer term assisted reproductive technologies kind of an area of research. Okay.
Let's take one more round because it's been a long day for Sonalde. I guess good. All right. Thank you very much, Professor Desai, for having us, for coming over here and giving us this very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.